Everybody, I am so pleased to have this discussion with Denmark's tech ambassador. Today we have Mikael Ekman, who's actually the acting tech ambassador. And we have given the link to his bio, so I won't do that right now. But what we're going to talk about is what the tech ambassador does and some of the issues between the US and Denmark, between Denmark and China and the rest of the world. So I'm going to start with a few questions and then we're going to open it up to your questions. But again, we are so glad to have everybody here today. So, Ambassador, let me start off with what's your typical day like? What do you do?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Susan, and thanks for the invite to join. So a typical morning, just to give you an example, I am now, it's just around 8 o'clock in San Francisco. I am on my third meeting. That's one of the advantages or disadvantages, if you will, of working for a European country. Is you on the west coast of the US, you get to get up very early and have a lot of early meetings. We also have part of our team sitting in Beijing, so it also goes into the other direction, some very late meetings as well. But my typical day and the typical day of our team is sort of a combination of a few different things. And of course, the last 3-4 months, our typical day has looked a little bit different than it usually does. But we've been put into the world basically to have a discussion around very important issues with the major technology firms. So of course, a huge part of our day is to simply go have meetings, be it in Mountain View or in Palo Alto or in Menlo Park or in Cupertino, where some of the big tech firms are based here in the Valley. To talk about both some of the good things that technology brings and areas where Denmark, Europe, companies, US and others can work together. But Susan, as you know, certainly also some of the less good things or some of the areas where we see challenges or risks coming from tech developments. So a lot of meetings with a lot of very, very smart and interesting people. And I gotta say, between you and me and the X number of people listening in here, it's been one of the great things about this job, which we've been in for about 3 years now, is that the kind of things we discuss and the people we discuss it with, I gotta say, it's very, very interesting, and you really feel that you are in the midst of a major revolution changing the world as we know it. So it's an exciting job.
Can you talk about techplomacy? Just to, many people may not have visited the website.
Absolutely. So just to give you sort of where it originated from, I think, with us today, we have sort of a mix of private sector people and some government officials potentially. So I know, in the eyes of the private sector, governments are not always the most innovative. Let's just be very honest about that. But in fact, this initiative came out of an innovation exercise within the Foreign Ministry of Denmark. So a group of my colleagues, in particular, some very innovation minded and also some younger colleagues, were asked to sort of take a few days out of their normal work schedule and go to a vacation home in Denmark and think deeply about the future of diplomacy, literally. And the senior management sort of locked the door and said, don't come out until you have some great recommendations for us. And one of the things they discussed was sort of how technology and what you might call the fourth industrial revolution is changing not only key sectors in a country like Denmark, all the things that we care about, energy, climate, healthcare, pharmaceuticals and so forth, but also foreign policy and the international relations and international cooperation. And the idea that they came out with was that what we really needed to gun up as a nation and as part of the European Union on the foreign policy dimensions of technology, because it's shaping values, it's shaping human rights, it's shaping our place in the world. And they came up with a suggestion, which, if you think about it, is actually not that innovative, considering we are a foreign ministry. But they came up with this idea of having a specific embassy to technology and an ambassador to the tech industry. And that's where this initiative came from. Luckily, we had senior management and a minister and a government that thought it was a great idea. So it built out of that. But of course, the idea is that if we are not able as a government and as a foreign ministry, a foreign service, to have a meaningful dialogue with the tech sector, then we are missing a huge part of the picture of where the world is heading today. Because whether you like it or not, the tech industry has become extremely powerful. I don't need to tell you, Susan, but if you look at this in economic terms, they have economic muscle that outweigh even some nation states. If you sit as I do and represent a nation state of about 5-6 million people, it's clear that when you look at these tech giants, they can really exercise a lot of influence also economically. Secondly, just in societal power, Facebook has around 2.5 billion monthly users on one of their 4 major platforms. That's an enormous societal reach that I would argue we've never seen before in history. And thirdly, we've seen some of these companies also grow into something akin to foreign policy actors. They probably wouldn't necessarily phrase it in those terms themselves. And it's important for me to say that we don't confuse the responsibilities and duties of nation states with private companies. But it is a fact that they have a huge way and a huge influence on foreign policy issues that used to be monopolized by states are now also impacted by the private tech companies. Things like, how do we fight terrorism? Things like, how do we promote human rights globally? Things like cybersecurity and protection of our critical infrastructure. All those areas are really impacted hugely by the private tech sector. So if we're not able to have a meaningful dialogue on the things where we agree and disagree, then we will not be able to do the job that we have been put into this world to do.
Yeah, and if I could just take that further, it's interesting to me because Denmark is the only country to do this. Like the United States, Canada have digital commercial officers whose job is to promote exports or understanding of digital economy issues, but they don't have an ambassador to the firms. Yet you see the firms too are quite different in their international affairs responsibility. There's a real difference between how, let's say, Salesforce approaches it versus how Google and Facebook. And each of them is distinct. And governments are distinct too, but yet, why have other governments not followed this model in your mind?
I wouldn't necessarily say that we're the only country that does it. We're the first country to do it. And we are the only country to do it with this specific model, where we have a tech ambassador on the ground in Silicon Valley. It's important to me to say, by the way, that part of our team is also in Copenhagen and in Beijing. So we do really have a real global mandate and a global team. But we have other countries and allies that have done, if not the same, then something similar, and also based on the same realization. So, we work very closely with the Australian cyber ambassador, who actually has a mandate that's not that different from ours. He's based in Canberra, so he's capital based. We work very closely with the French digital ambassador. We have good dialogue with the German digital ambassador and the Dutch and so forth. And I actually just coincidentally saw the other day that the UK is in the process of hiring a technology envoy to be based here in San Francisco. So I would say that's probably something that looks a little bit like what we do. So I do think that over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen definitely a momentum in diplomatic circles around these issues. I was just in a meeting, Susan, last week with a group of 20 plus digital ambassadors from Europe. So people within foreign services that have been designated to think about technology and foreign policy. Next week, together with the Australian cyber ambassador, we are hosting a fairly large virtual gathering of around 20-25 countries from all over the world. They are tech envoys, tech ambassadors, for a meeting with a senior executive in Facebook, where we will discuss some of the issues that we are dealing with today. So there is, you could say, a momentum in diplomatic circles, and I think that's based on the same realization as Denmark. I'm proud to say, and now I'll be a little bit un-Danish, but I'm proud to say that we moved first on this, and I think we have managed, especially considering our small size, we have managed to make a big imprint in the diplomatic thinking around the world on these issues.
And we're grateful to you for that, because given that the internet is global and is in a sense a form of a commons, we are going to need interoperable and internationally accepted norms and rules at some point, and we seem far from that. With that in mind, can you talk a little bit about what kind of changes or initiatives you want to encourage beyond working together with other countries that have digital ambassadors? What are some of your priorities in terms of your role and your counterpart's role in Beijing? Is it just to communicate Denmark's position, or is it to advocate for cyber norms or whatever?
You mean vis-a-vis other countries?
Or vis-a-vis the firms, which are
Okay, well, yeah, it is, as I said before, it is about talking about certain opportunities. You know, I think what we've seen over the last 3-4 months with the COVID-19 response has certainly underlined that we are all very, very dependent on technology and digital tools and platforms, be it in our work life or our kids' education, or public service delivery, or even, you know, grocery shopping and workout sessions. You know, we've all done it in front of our screen at home for 3-4 months. But goes without saying that the risks associated with rapid technological development, and maybe also the sort of the data-driven business model that we see in particular here in Silicon Valley, has also been a very, very huge part of our job. So let me give you maybe as illustration a couple of examples of the kind of topics we've raised with the tech industry to start out with. I'll start with a kind of a bleak and you know, a little bit dramatic example, but you know, we had a very tragic incident a couple of years, a year and a half ago, I guess, where a young Danish lady and a young Norwegian lady were brutally murdered, killed in Morocco by terrorist sympathizers, and video material started to flourish quite rapidly on social media platforms from that horrendous crime. And we were phoned up one late evening by our intelligence services and police back home in Copenhagen, and they asked us to immediately contact major social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, and so forth, and make sure, one, that they were aware of the content, and secondly, that they did everything they could using AI and you know, human resources to eliminate that content on their platforms. And you could ask, you know, would that have happened if Denmark didn't have a tech ambassador? Well, yes, of course it was. There are certain channels to, you know, for dealing with these kind of things. But what we experienced was that it happened a lot quicker and a lot more efficient, because we had built those high-level networks into the major tech headquarters here in the Bay Area. And our you know, authorities back home were very grateful for that rapid response, because of course it's you know, it's consideration to the family and friends, but there's also a certain radicalizing potential in content like that. So it's very important for us to get it taken off the internet as soon as possible. So a second example, a little bit more sort of usual business, was about so half a year ago, revelation or stories broke in Danish and European newspapers that in particular Google and Apple and a certain other companies had been listening in to conversation via their intelligent assistants, you know, Google Siri, Google Assistant and Apple Siri, within the 4 walls of the home in Denmark and elsewhere. And of course they do that, but they had also transcribed conversations that users wouldn't expect them to transcribe or listen into and record due to different technical errors. And that's of course you know, a reason for concern. It was for my foreign minister. So he asked us to go out and have a conversation with those 2 companies about what is actually happening, what extent, how much is recorded that shouldn't be recorded, and then of course express our government's viewpoints on those things and concerns. So this is just 2 examples in each end of the spectrum of what the kind of dialogue we have with the companies. And you asked also about China. And we have a very small team in China, and they sort of help build our relations with the tech industry there. And it's been interesting to see that we're actually able to have you know, the same kind of dialogue with Chinese tech companies. Of course, we do it in a little bit of a different way, and we talk about a little bit different things. But for example, when we go and visit, let's say a facial recognition company in China, we also ask about, so what kind of safeguards do you have in place to protect privacy and rights? When we go and talk to Alibaba in Hangzhou, we also talk about, what are the roles and responsibilities of huge tech companies when you look at it from a Chinese perspective. So it's the same kind of a dialogue we have, but of a little bit of a different question sometimes.
That's fascinating. Several people have emailed us and asked us if you could answer this question. How have US-China tech frictions affected your work?
How has US-China, sorry, I didn't hear that.
Are the frictions between the Trump administration, so really in terms of US actions to protect perceived US comparative advantage in tech, or let's call it data-driven tech, affected, let's say, Denmark and the EU?
That's a great question. I would probably respond like this. It hasn't directly impacted our work, but it's of course something that we pay an enormous amount of attention to, because in the end, what we do is a foreign policy initiative. This is about looking at the world and the global world order through the eyes of technology or digital issues. And of course, it will be no surprise to anyone that over the last year or so, this has really turned into a geopolitical discussion and also a values-based discussion. What kind of technology do we want to see? Who can we work with? How do we think about supply chains? All those kind of questions. I don't need to tell you. You follow this very closely already. But it has highlighted, I think, in Europe, the need to also become a little bit more ambitious in the European digital agenda. If you look at the numbers, Susan, it's very clear that even though Europe is today leading on tech policy, I would argue, GDPR and copyright directives and other issues, Europe is definitely trailing behind when it comes to sort of tech development, R&D, and not least private sector. If you look at the 20 largest firms, or most valuable tech firms today, they are all, without exception, either American or Chinese. If you look at the share of venture capital investments into AI, I think the numbers from 2017 was around just under half went to China, around 40% to the US, and only around 12% to the rest of the world, including Europe. Those numbers shift a little bit from time to time. I think now the US is on top again. But no matter what, no matter how you look at it, it's not a very optimistic trajectory if you're European at heart and if you're Danish. So we're happy to see that the European Commission has now put forward this ambitious digital agenda where we try and balance the regulatory question, so putting some guardrails and some frameworks around how technology impacts society, but also very importantly trying to invest in the European tech industry and trying to promote companies. So maybe, just maybe in 20 years, when we talk again, we might have 1 or 2 European companies in that group of the most valuable. And I think that's not an easy thing to do, but it's definitely a discussion we need to have. And I think Margrethe Vestager, who is coincidentally the Danish European Commissioner, but who's now in charge of, you could say, all things digital, I think she framed it nicely in a recent debate where she said something along the lines that, if Europe are to regulate AI, we need to build and understand AI. And I think that's a good way to look at that duality. We can't only have the sort of the stick, we also need to be able to innovate and do those things. And there we are tracking behind. And I think the trade war and the frictions have only underlined that.
Yeah, just today's news, there was a discussion of this related to the G7. I do see Europe taking some steps that, aside from US protectionism related to data-driven issues regarding taxes, et cetera, the Gaia X cloud makes, is very understandable, but it does lead to some concerns. Although I think everything that I've read, they say the cloud will be open to anyone who wants to participate related to But, you know, there is this sense that it's turning into these three digital realms, which could undermine what's very much needed, which an internationally accepted norms and approaches. So I'm glad to see progress at the UN or at the OECD. What about you? Does Denmark take a role in trying to push these international?
Very, very much so, and you know, I would agree with you. I think, you know, now let's the debate around clouds and so forth, and data sovereignty or autonomy or whatever you want to call it in Europe is just starting. You know, I think from our point it would be important that, of course, we need to build European capacities and capabilities, but we don't necessarily need to do that on expense of our great relationships across the world, and not least across the transatlantic, that will continue to be very important for Europe and for Denmark, to be honest. But in terms of the UN and other tracks, it's actually been a major focus of our work, in particularly over the last year and a half, has been to try and multilateralize. It's a big word this early in the morning. Our diplomacy initiative by promoting that thinking and those priorities within our multilateral settings. So as a small open economy and a very, you know, puny one, you know, we depend so much on the rules-based international order. It's our access to the table, you could say, it's our safeguard. It's the only protection we have from being throttled by the international forces of global policy. So we are so dependent on the UN, OECD, NATO as well, you know, WTO and so forth, delivering answers in some of these frameworks. So one of the things we've spent, the European Union, of course, as well as our main regional group. But one major focus of our work over the last couple of years has actually been this UN high-level panel for digital cooperation. I'm sure you saw last week the UN Secretary General presented his roadmap for digital cooperation, which is, you know, the result, you know, the result of a 2-year-long process that started back in 2018 with the appointment of a high-level panel with Jack Ma and Melinda Gates as the co-chairs. By the way, another great example of how bipolar this digital world is becoming. They didn't put a European in charge of that panel. And you know, we've been putting in all along Danish priorities into that process. We've also supported it by bringing people out to Silicon Valley to have dialogue directly with the companies. And we were pretty happy with the result that the Secretary General put forward last week. I don't know if you or participants here have had a chance to really dive into it yet, but there are some very strong wordings around how we need to safeguard human rights in the digital age. You know, human rights apply equally online as offline. There are also some very, very strong recommendations on digital inclusion. So how do we make sure that those 4 billion that are not online today, but, you know, comes online and have access to affordable internet and you know, the necessary digital skills and tools. And lastly, you know, when we talk about you know, trust and security in cyberspace, it's extremely important. We think that we sort of, you know, take the starting point on the results we already have and the things we've already agreed on. You know, within the UN, you know, we've agreed on 11 norms for responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and it's important for us we stand on those norms when we move forward and talk more about how do we strengthen this collaboration. And by the way, one of the things I actually found interesting in the report, you know, usually a UN report, you know about 95% of what's going to be in there, but I actually found it interesting how relatively direct the language around the tech industry is in that report. You know, it basically calls out the sort of the data-driven, surveillance-based business model, and says that you need to think carefully about if that's the right way to do it. So I thought that was you know, slightly surprising that it did that. So that is very important. We also work with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we support them so they are able to engage with the big tech firms to try and translate international human rights law into business models and products and services that they provide. So we do a lot.
We recently had a discussion with David Kay who had done some very interesting reports on freedom of expression and the surveillance business model. And now there's another UN report on the model itself. One final thing I wanted to ask you very briefly, have you seen the trade agreement from Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile called the DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement? It's all about, it's 63 pages. I'll email it to you, but it's really worth a read. I want to shut up now and get to the audience questions. So one of our audience asks, what's the state of data diplomacy in Latin America and the Caribbean? Have you exchanged best practices?
We have, I'll be very honest with you, not to the extent that we would probably like to. We after all have limited resources, but we've spent quite a bit of time with the Inter-American Development Bank, I guess is the name of it, where we've briefed the bank in Washington, and we've had good discussion with some of the countries there. We've spent quite a bit of time with Mexico, which is, I guess, part of North America, but which is really a front runner when it comes to promoting digital diplomacy and technology in the United Nations and elsewhere. They played a huge role in this area, and it is now becoming part of the UN Security Council. So hopefully they'll continue to do great work in that area. So we haven't, to be very honest, we haven't spent as much time on that region as we would have liked. But maybe it's something we can find resources to do in the future.
Thank you. Okay, our next question relates to taxation as a foreign policy issue now related to digital platforms. Could you give your opinion on, first, how Denmark is addressing this issue, and secondly, what are the major drawbacks?
It's a very tough question, and be negotiated heavily in Paris and elsewhere in the OECD. And I think there are no easy answers. I mean, Denmark has been engaging in the process like all other countries, and I'll be very frank with you. I mean, my government and my prime minister and my foreign minister, they think it is extremely important we address this question, and it's extremely important that we find some doable answers, but we should do it in the right way. Denmark is a welfare society. Our entire way our country works is built on taxation. It's built on it's our ability to fund schools, infrastructure, and so forth. We are increasingly seeing challenges with the digital business model, that we are not able to tax that in the right way. And I mean, I don't think, I haven't actually seen any numbers on it, but my guess would be that the Corona crisis and the COVID-19 has only sort of underlined that there are companies that are benefiting tremendously and are doing very well, and not necessarily being taxed in the most useful way or in the right way. So Denmark has been very active within the OECD, and we would certainly prefer a deal in the OECD for sure. But I think my government has also said that if we cannot reach a deal in the OECD, then they're ready to look at possibilities within the European Union. As you know, the EU Commission has already put forward a couple of proposals within the EU on that question as well. So it's extremely tricky, and I hope that somehow we'll manage to find that progress in the OECD. Although I saw today's statements, or was it yesterday's statements, doesn't look too good in terms of
the
US participation.
Right, except that here's one thing that I think the article ignored, Alan Rappaport's article in the New York Times at least. States are looking at this in the US now, and including New York State and Maryland. And so my gut is, because of COVID-19 and because the US government has not moved forward, this is becoming more and more of a possible option, which will make it pretty hard to not find internationally accepted strategies, let alone national, the US national. So I think the position on this is going to change over time. That's just my opinion. Okay, our next question is antitrust policy also within your purview?
You could say antitrust is handled very, very clearly within the European Commission, right, on behalf of the member states as part of the internal single market in Europe. We do, of course, follow it quite closely, but I would say in particular, some of the political debate around antitrust, it's been interesting to see how in the US, and I'm not an expert on US domestic politics, just be clear on that. I sit in San Francisco and not in Washington, but it has been interesting to see how antitrust and regulation of the tech industry has almost become a political selling point now, including in the run-up to the presidential election. We saw different candidates. Elizabeth Warren, not the least, but I think also some of the others have almost campaigned on the need to rein in the technology industry. And some have talked about antitrust, some have talked about other issues. But that's a debate, of course, we've had for a long time in Europe, and where we've probably also taken some steps, in terms of fines for monopoly-like behavior and so forth. But it's interesting to see how, and I would love your assessment of this, Susan, but whether that debate will continue here in the US, and whether it's a real debate or whether it's more sort of due to the political season that we are in right now.
I think it's a real debate, but I think part of the debate, I think, is we haven't caught up to the international implications of antitrust. It's funny for me because the ITO, the thing that became the GATT, included competition policies and included labor rights. So at the end of the Second World War, we were supposed to have this international organization to govern trade, and it looked at spillover effects on other domestic policies like employment and competition policy. And now we're coming full circle, and we kind of are realizing when companies are so global, you need a global competition policy. But will we get there and find norms on that, given the very different approaches, let's say, of the EU, Canada, the United States alone towards how you do this? I don't know. Maybe people in the audience have some more thoughts on that. It'll be interesting to hear their questions. Here's another question. The Copenhagen Democracy Summit just finished day one. Tomorrow, they're talking about misinformation democracy. And so this thoughtful person is asking, is promoting the use of technology to promote democracy part of your portfolio? I'll just rephrase it. Yeah. Do you see, as part of your function as an ambassador to the tech sector, promoting, is part of your responsibility using technology to advance democracy? Absolutely.
I would almost say it's a core part of what we do, but we do it in different ways, both vis-a-vis the industry, but certainly also vis-a-vis other countries. Let's face it, we've probably been naive, all of us, or many of us, about the real implications and long-term implications of technology on democracy. I love the way, I saw it being phrased at one point by Joseph Nye, who of course is one of the fantastic voices on foreign policy, but actually also on technology and disinformation. He said something along the lines that the dilemma here is that technologies that have been designed, developed, iterated in Western liberal democracies are now being used against us to exploit existing vulnerabilities in our societies. And I think that frames it pretty well when you think about what has happened on platforms like Facebook and maybe Twitter and YouTube and others, that bad actors have managed to take advantage of insufficient safeguards on those platforms to try and influence our elections and influence democratic dialogue and debate, not just in the US, but also elsewhere for sure. And I think we've woken up to that. And of course, since 2016 onwards, not the least, but we've seen it as well during the COVID-19 pandemic, where disinformation has literally become a threat to life and death, right? If we pass around the wrong kind of healthcare information, that has been tricky. We've seen that in Europe as well, and it's been it's been an interesting thing to follow over the last couple of months. So we worked a lot both with the companies, but also with other countries. I want to maybe just highlight Canada, that has really been a trailblazer when it comes to thinking about how do we defend democracy in a digital age. I think they worked together with Microsoft and others. And at one point, they also had, I think, a dedicated minister in charge of this area. And they have done some great thinking around what are the real democratic implications of this. And again, Susan, I come a little bit back to that transatlantic alliance. I think what we need to avoid at all cost right now is to go into sort of a conflict between the US and Europe around some of these issues, because at the end of the day, we come from the same value set and the same democratic traditions and procedures and debates. And we need to avoid, if I can put it a little bit sort of squarely, we need to avoid a tech lash in Europe and a EU lash, in the US or in Silicon Valley. We need to make sure that we remain strong partners and that transatlantic alliance is stronger than ever at a time where digital authoritarianism, attacks on democracy, attacks on human rights are really going up around the world. So I think that's extremely important and something we try and work quite heavily on.
Well, I, for one, I cannot speak for this audience, but I am very grateful for that, because we do share these values, and many of us really yearn to learn from and collaborate with every country in Europe. Okay, here's a really interesting question, which may be tough for you to answer. Do you find that tech companies bring up their concerns to you? Maybe one example would be the mashup of regulations around the world. Section 230 or that kind of approach. What are we talking about when you're a social network, and what are the responsibilities of those where the posts are published? Are the publishers? These questions. I'm just giving an example. Have you seen them say to you, Denmark, we don't know what to do here, because we're not a government. We are not at the UN.
Yes. Yes is the short answer. In Silicon Valley, they talk a lot about value proposition. What is your pitch? What is your value proposition? And part of our value proposition is not economic. It's not investment. It's not, it's not the, a Series A funding, right? That's not our value proposition. Our value proposition is to be a convener of messages. It is to present what we think are important, also when it comes to regulation, and also to listen carefully what companies think are important or unclear or difficult or challenging. And then we convey that back in a loyal way to our decision makers in Copenhagen, in Brussels, and elsewhere. So very often we sit with senior executives at the tech companies, and they say, listen, we would really appreciate your advice on this. How should we engage on GDPR or privacy? How should we engage on copyright? How should we engage on the Digital Service Act that we're looking at in Europe? We've discussed Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act at length as well with some of the companies, also for us to understand what are some of the concerns. And it runs deep in the Danish DNA to not just talk about public-private partnerships, but actually walk the talk and do it. So when we do regulation and policy in domestic setting as well, we always do it with the private sector at the table, because in the end, the private sector is part of the implementation process, and they have expertise that we do not have in government necessarily. So for us, it's not strange at all to invite the private sector into the room when we discuss these things, so we get regulation right. We don't want to throttle innovation. We don't want to throttle the space for companies to grow. And at the end, that's also what our society lives off. But of course, that doesn't mean we agree on everything. There's certain things where we listen and say, well, that's great, but we don't necessarily agree for this and this reason. But having the dialogue is so important, and we have that almost every time we meet with the tech companies. So it's also to try and inform policy making and regulation back home in Europe in a little bit more productive way.
Thank you. Okay, here's another question. Is part of your job to attract US tech firms to build data centers in Denmark?
It's actually not. And I can say that clearly because we already have great team working on that, and they were here long before we arrived, and they had already managed to attract a couple of mega scale data centers to Denmark. So we actually don't do that job. Sometimes we can help support it, or sometimes we can help to open doors, but we already have people working on that. So our work is not commercial, or it's not about investments. It is about politics, and it's about representing political viewpoints in the dialogue with the industry. And I would also say, Susan, that's where we are a little bit unique. That's what we didn't have before this initiative. We had a commercial dialogue, and we had cooperation around investment, but we didn't really have that sort of tough, sometimes very frank and honest exchange around policy, around big questions like human rights and privacy and terrorism and these kind of things.
So would you see a supporting or complementary role for a free and publicly available corporate benchmark of the digital technology sector in tech diplomacy? I'm not sure I understand this question, but then she writes, software industry self-regulation.
I'm not sure I fully understand it either, but just to say, I mean, I think the Danish viewpoint and my personal viewpoint would be, as much self-regulation and positive action we see from the platforms and the companies, the better. I don't think we have a desire to over-regulate the tech industry. Again, we are a very innovation-oriented country, and we don't have any problem with companies earning pardon my French, shitload of money, as long as they pay the necessary taxes that they should be paying, and they contribute positively to society. I mean, that's the bottom line. Of course, we don't want to under-regulate either. We want to make sure that we get it right, and we put up the right frameworks. Also, when you look at something like content moderation, or the kind of things we expect from the companies, I think at the end of the day, if we don't see the proactive action from the companies, and we could discuss at length for many hours whether we are seeing that right now or not. I would say we've seen a lot of progress, but there's definitely still things we need to see improve more. But I can say at the end of the day, if we don't see that action across different areas, then I think governments will be ready to regulate. And that's what we've seen in Europe with a couple of countries that have gone out now and done content regulation, or platform regulation, and put down takedown notices and liability for some of these questions for illegal and illegal content on platforms.
One thing that concerns me that I think about a lot is these data-driven technologies. I'm sorry, my cat is having a frantic scream fest right now. So I'm sorry if people are listening to her. But in any case, so we have these technologies that are essentially public goods, because they can do so much good for us. And let's just take AI as an example. But they're governed at the national level, if they are governed, and they're provided by private firms. Do you look at those things as, do you say, like, how should we engage with firms on AI, or how does that work? Or is
Yes,
it general?
absolutely. That's always part of the discussion. I mean, one of the things we're looking at is how does algorithm usually run and fueled by AI, how does that impact content moderation and what is being taken down and not taken down? We've also looked intensively at autonomous weapon systems and how AI is playing out there. We're even looking at something as surreal as quantum technology, and what will that mean for encryption in the future and for security, and what will it mean for NATO and the alliance. So our focus area is emerging technologies, and we always appreciate the dialogue with the companies on this. Just a little anecdote, Susan. When we arrived, Casper, the former tech ambassador, and myself, about 3 years ago to Silicon Valley, we both come from diplomatic backgrounds. We are not particularly don't have strong tech insights and knowledge, but we managed to build it. But our first meeting was with an engineer at Google working on AI and audio, so voice recognition, these kind of things. And that was, even to this day, that was one of the mind-blowing conversations that we've had. Just listen to him explain how far this area actually is, how far a company like Google are. And when we asked, well, isn't it still countries leading this effort? He kind of leaned back and just laughed and kind of raised his eyes to the sky and said, "You have no idea how further ahead we are than even governments." So it illustrates well how the power has shifted from traditional public-driven innovation and research to now basically taking place, to a large extent taking place in the tech headquarters. So of course we talk to them about AI and try to understand how that will impact our society and the things we care about.
So in a sense, if he sat back in his chair and kind of laughed, but yet all these governments have AI plans. I think at our last count, we found 37 governments have strategies to incentivize the development of AI, let alone other technologies. So
which I think is
them grasping at straws to control these companies?
No, I think that's important. Denmark has an AI strategy as well, and that's about promoting research in Denmark, trying to build a national language base when it comes to AI, trying to think about what kind of data pools and data sources do we have that could be that could be a powerful tool for developing AI. In Denmark, for example, we have a huge public sector database. We have 50 years of central civic registration data, everything from when you're being born to who you married to where you live and where you study are being collected in Denmark. By the way, something that when you look at it from an American point of view, I think it would be unthinkable to have that kind of government mandated data collection. But in Denmark, it's a non-debate. It's something we are very comfortable with. So it's, of course, every country, every region has to think carefully about our approach to AI. European Commission has just put out I think a white paper on AI as well. So I think that's a necessity. But I think it's also important just to remember, because this is a fact, that it is the major tech firms today that are really driving innovation in this area. It is in Google and Microsoft and Amazon and Facebook and Apple and Tencent and Alibaba and so forth, SenseTime. It is really where we're seeing a lot of the data being collected and a lot of the machine learning development taking place. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have national ambitions, and governments shouldn't think about what policies or what normative principles or ethics do we want to lay down on this. But those two things, I think, are just a fact of life.
Building on that question, coming back to where we started, one attendee asked, how do firms respond to you? Like, especially if they're a new, small firm, are they skeptical? Are they receptive?
Always with.
I'm gonna put my cat out while you're answering because this is getting ridiculous.
Yes.
Answer. I'm just gonna.
We can. Honestly, I don't think we can hear the cat, but feel free to. Just to answer that question, and that is, of course, the $1 million question that I, had expected and been waiting for. And I'll be very honest with you and say that it's been certainly a mixed picture in terms of the way we've been received by the tech industry, also the very big companies. Some have been open and has immediately seen the value that this kind of dialogue brought to the table for them as well. The viewpoints on regulation, understanding what is the thinking in Brussels and so forth. And others have been reluctant from the beginning. Some have warmed up, as we managed to build the relationship, but some even today are a little bit reluctant to have that dialogue with us, either because they don't necessarily want to have that discussion with countries in general, or because they don't necessarily understand what it is that we also offer in return. And the person also asked about the very small companies. And I think it's fair to say that, if you are a small startup, that you're sort of, you're still getting VC funding, you are still in a process where you're building your government relations team. my guess, without having ever been an entrepreneur, is that that's probably one of the last things you build up is your government relations team. First, you get the the product to work, you get the engineers working, you start to think about the business model, and then questions around policy and regulation and government relations come a little bit further down the line, and I think that's fair. We don't engage tremendously with the very small new startups, and simply for the reason that they usually do not have a huge impact on Denmark. We put our eggs in the basket of the companies that impact Danes most, right? All the social media companies, some of the major providers of technology to Denmark, because that's where we find the dialogue to be most interesting. From time to time, we do meet with small startups if we think they have a particularly interesting technology or a viewpoint on certain things.
Can I push you a little on that? Because when you say the firms that Danes most interact with, but here's one that really disturbs me. I've been looking at comparing privacy policies of productivity sites like Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever. And it's kind of amazing to me, the differences between them that I've learned just in the last 24 hours. So how do you know what I mean? Like, until someone exposes it, like it's all an AI trap to get data, seems to me. Same with many apps. So maybe that hasn't come to the fore yet. How do you think about those things?
Can you try and frame that again?
So a lot of things that are designed to promote productivity are, they use AI to get people's data. And that's what, Shoshana Zuboff was saying. They're like a honey trap. And sometimes even governments do that, right? We've seen some apps that are essentially surveillance apps.
Sure.
And, they give you a benefit for free, or you pay a small amount. And so, but people don't think of it that way yet.
No, yes.
They're not woken up to it. And I don't know how to get them to wake up to it. I've been trying, but so, if Danes haven't woken up to it, what do you do?
I think Danes have, and I don't think necessarily this clashes with what I said before. I think I also said that the way I would frame it is we've been naive about the true power and purpose of these business models and these tools. And I think what Susanna Zuboff Professor Zuboff have said, has been maybe the most eloquent layout of those dilemmas and those mechanisms that we've ever seen, right? And I think Danes have woken up to it. Have all Danes woken up to them? Have we woken up to the extent that we should? Probably not. But I think there is a debate in Denmark and in Europe around collection of data. And by the way, I want to just to nuance the debate a little bit. Not only around the Facebook and Googles of this world, but just look at the debate around contact tracing apps in relation to COVID-19. In Europe and elsewhere, there's been a huge debate about whether sort of government sanctions apps was a good thing for society, and how do you roll back those tools when we at one point are able to do that again. Coincidentally today the app in Denmark was actually launched, the contact tracing app for COVID-19, but that is the culmination of a fairly long and heated public debate, even in a country like Denmark, around what kind of safeguards do we put into an app like that? Do we base it on the Google Apple platform, or do we develop something ourselves? And that debate has taken place many places around the world. And in the end, the trick here is, Susan, that technology only works if we have trust in technology, right? If you don't trust the contact tracing app, you're not going to download it, and the whole system falls apart. If you don't reach a certain percentage of society, there's really no point in having this digital contact tracing system. But you could transport that argument to many other technologies as well. If we don't have trust in it, it won't work. I think Facebook and Google and other data-driven companies, have they lost the trust of citizens? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. Have their reputation been hurt? I think certainly yes. I think Cambridge Analytica really hit Facebook, not just among policymakers and regulators, but also among at least my population in Denmark. I think there's more skepticism around some of these questions today. Now, has Facebook afterwards taken a lot of steps to remedy that? They've definitely taken a lot of steps. They've maybe also taken some good steps, but I think the jury is still out on whether they've done enough. I think hardly a day passes where we don't have a new kind of story in the news cycle about something happening on social media platforms that shouldn't be happening. So it's definitely still a heated debate. So I would just push a little bit back to say I think it's taking a while and we are not there yet, but I think people are trying to understand what are the kind of mechanisms at work here and the importance of safeguarding our privacy.
I think Europe has played a major role in teaching us of the importance of that, and we're grateful. And thank you so much for taking the time to engage with us. It's very kind of you, and hope to see you sometime in Washington without face masks on. Mm-hmm. And without any sort of bad feelings between our countries. So thank you for the good work that you're doing. And thank you to our sponsors, and thank you everybody for participating. And just so you know, our next webinar will be on the 30th on the US-UK digital trade chapter in the US-UK free trade agreement. And then we're going to look at the DEPA. So looking forward to that. Thank you all so much, and I hope everybody has a great day. And thank you, Ambassador. It's most kind of you. Bye.
Thank you very much.